Good evening, and welcome to our Sleep to Lore series. In this space, we explore the deep and often tragic stories behind famous tales, letting the narrative unfold at a calm and steady pace, perfect for relaxation and sleep. Tonight, we turn our attention to a secluded hotel in the Colorado Rockies and the family hired to watch over it during a long, silent winter. We will be exploring the story of Stephen King's The Shining, but not as a simple ghost story. Instead, we will look at it as the deep and personal tragedy of the Torrance family. We will examine the cracks that were already in their foundation, long before they ever saw the imposing walls of the Overlook Hotel. This is a story about a good man's battle with his own worst instincts, a mother's desperate hope to hold her world together, and a little boy who could see the darkness that was coming for them all. If you enjoy these deep dives into story and lore, please consider subscribing to the channel or leaving a comment. It helps us continue to create this content for you. Before we begin, I have a question for you all. What is the loneliest place you have ever been? It could be a remote location or a crowded room where you felt completely isolated. Please share your thoughts in the comment section below. It is always interesting to see how the idea of isolation affects us all. And now, settle in. Let the world outside fade away as we begin our story. The story of the Torrance family and the winter that changed everything. Chapter 1. The Fractured Foundation. The story of the Torrance family's destruction does not begin on the winding mountain roads leading to the Overlook Hotel. It does not start with the turn of a key in a grand, empty ballroom, nor with the first fall of snow that would cut them off from the world. It begins much earlier, in quieter places. It starts in the cramped rooms of a small apartment in Boulder, Colorado. It begins in the simmering silence between a husband and a wife, in the guilty memories that haunt a father's mind, and in the anxious heart of a little boy who saw too much. The Overlook Hotel, for all its power and malice, was not the cause of the tragedy. It was merely the stage upon which a tragedy already in motion would reach its terrible and inevitable conclusion. The hotel was an amplifier, taking the small, secret fears and resentments of a troubled family and turning them into a symphony of horror. But the instruments were already there, tuned and ready to be played. John Daniel Torrance, known to everyone as Jack, saw the caretaker position as a lifeline. To him, it was not a descent into isolation, but a final, desperate ascent toward salvation. He was a man who felt the weight of his own failures like a physical burden on his shoulders. In his younger years, he was filled with a bright, burning ambition. He was going to be a writer, not just a writer, but a great one. He dreamed of novels that would be read for generations, of plays that would be performed on grand stages. He had the intellect for it, and he had a fire in his belly. But the years had a way of turning fire to ash. The great American novel remained a scattered collection of notes and half-finished chapters. The plays were nothing but dialogue spoken to himself in the dead of night. Life, with its relentless demands for rent and groceries, had gotten in the way. He had become a teacher, an English teacher, at a prep school in Vermont. It should have been a respectable life, a good life. But to Jack, it felt like a cage. He saw the blank, uninterested faces of his students and saw a reflection of his own extinguished dreams. He was teaching the great works of others while his own great work withered inside him. This bitterness became a constant companion, a sour taste in his mouth that he tried to wash away with alcohol. The bottle became his friend, his confidant, the one thing that seemed to understand the vastness of his disappointment. It gave him a temporary feeling of power, of brilliance. It loosened his tongue and made him feel like the great writer he was meant to be. But the morning always came, bringing with it a throbbing headache and an even heavier dose of self-loathing. The alcohol did not solve his problems, it only postponed them, and when they returned, they were bigger and uglier than before. His temper, always a short fuse, became explosive. It was a rage born of frustration. He was angry at the world for not recognizing his genius, angry at his students for their apathy, and most of all, angry at himself for his weakness. This anger needed a target, and one day it found one. A student named George Hatfield, a boy on the debate team, had let the air out of Jack's tires. It was a petty, childish prank. But for Jack, on that day, it felt like the final insult in a long line of humiliations. He did not see a boy who had made a mistake. He saw a symbol of everything that was holding him back. In a blind fury, he grabbed the boy, his hands shaking with a strength that terrified even himself. He hurt the boy. He did not mean to, not really, but the rage was a storm and he was lost in it. The school board, of course, could not overlook such an incident. He was fired. His career as a teacher, the very thing he resented but depended upon, was over. He had lost his job, his reputation, and another piece of his soul. With the family's finances in ruins, they moved to Colorado, where his wife Wendy had family. They lived in a small, cheap apartment that always felt dark, even in the middle of the day. The walls seemed to be closing in on Jack, a constant reminder of how far he had fallen. But the move brought with it a resolution. He was going to stop drinking, for Wendy, for their son, Danny. He made a promise, and he meant it with every fiber of his being. He put the bottle down, and the physical craving was an agony. But there was a deeper, more difficult challenge. It is something known as the dry drunk. The alcohol is gone, but the alcoholic thinking remains. The anger, the resentment, the habit of blaming everyone else for your own problems, that all stayed behind. He was sober, but he was not at peace. The rage still simmered, and without the release of alcohol, it had nowhere to go. It just sat inside him, a pool of boiling oil waiting for a spark. And the spark came on a day he would replay in his mind for the rest of his life. He was trying to write, trying to finally make something of himself. The words were not coming. The pages were blank, mocking him with their emptiness. His son, Danny, only a small child, was playing in the room. He was a happy, energetic boy, and in his play, he accidentally knocked over a stack of Jack's papers, scattering them across the floor. It was nothing, a simple accident, a child being a child. But to Jack, in that moment of intense frustration, it felt like a deliberate act of sabotage. It felt like the universe itself was conspiring to keep him from his work. The rage that he had been holding back for so long erupted. It was a white-hot flash, a complete loss of control. He grabbed his son, his little boy, and he shook him. In the violent motion, Danny fell and his arm bent at an unnatural angle. There was a sound, a small, sickening crack. And then came the screaming. The moment the sound of his son's pain hit his ears, the rage vanished, replaced by a cold, tidal wave of horror. He looked down at his own hands, the hands that had just harmed his own child, and he saw them as monsters' hands. He saw the terror in Danny's eyes, a terror directed at him, his father. And in that instant, Jack Torrance broke. A part of him died. The guilt was an anchor, dragging him down into a dark, bottomless ocean of self-hatred. He had done the one thing a father should never do. He had become the monster. He had become his own father, a violent, abusive man whose memory he had spent his whole life trying to escape. The cycle had continued, and he was its latest, most shameful link. This memory became the central pillar of his life. Every day he woke up with it, and every night he went to sleep with it. He tried to atone. He stopped drinking for good this time. He was gentle with Danny, overly so. He tried to be the perfect father, the perfect husband, but it was all an act, a desperate performance to convince himself and his family that the monster was gone. But he knew it was still there, sleeping just beneath the surface. He was terrified of it. This fear made him weak, and it made him defensive. He could not stand to be criticized, could not stand to be questioned, because any suggestion that he was failing felt like a confirmation that the monster was winning. So when his friend Al Shockley, a wealthy man with connections, offered him the job as the winter caretaker of the Overlook Hotel, Jack clung to it like a drowning man to a piece of driftwood. 5 months of isolation, no distractions, no students, no neighbors, no temptations of the bar down the street. It was, in his mind, the perfect environment to finally write his book, and more importantly, to prove to himself and his family that he could be trusted. That he was a good man after all. He saw it as a place of healing, a quiet sanctuary where he could finally slay his demons. He did not understand, could not possibly understand, that he was walking willingly into a place that fed on demons like his. Winifred Torrance, or Wendy, lived a life defined by hope. It was her greatest strength and her most profound weakness. She was a woman who desperately wanted to believe in the best version of the people she loved, even when the evidence pointed to the contrary. Her entire life had been a search for the stable, loving family she never had. Her own mother was a cold and critical woman, a person who could find fault in a sunset. From her mother, Wendy learned that love was conditional, that approval had to be earned and could be revoked at any moment. This upbringing left her with a deep-seated insecurity and an overwhelming desire to create a home that was the complete opposite of the one she grew up in. She wanted warmth, unconditional love, and above all, safety. When she met Jack, she saw all the potential for that life. He was brilliant, charming, and passionate. He made her laugh. He saw her, truly saw her, in a way no one else ever had. She fell in love not just with the man he was, but with the man she believed he could be. She saw the great writer inside him, and she became his most ardent supporter. She believed in his talent with a fierce, unwavering loyalty. When his drinking became a problem, she told herself it was just a phase, the stress of a creative mind. When his temper flared, she made excuses for him. She became an expert at walking on eggshells, at navigating his moods, at saying the right thing to soothe the brewing storm. She did this not because she was weak, but because she had invested her entire dream of a happy family in him. To admit that Jack was deeply flawed was to admit that her dream was impossible, and that was a truth she was not ready to face. The incident with Danny's arm was the moment her hope was almost shattered. Seeing her child in pain, hurt by the man who was supposed to protect him, was a wound that never truly healed. A part of her was terrified of Jack after that day. A cold knot of fear took up permanent residence in her stomach, but another part of her, the part that had been conditioned to smooth things over and keep the peace, took control. Jack was so full of remorse, so genuinely horrified by what he had done. He swore he would change, he quit drinking, he was gentle and kind, and Wendy, because she needed to, chose to believe him. She buried her fear under a thick blanket of forgiveness. She told herself that it was a one-time event, a terrible mistake born of alcohol and stress, a mistake that would never be repeated. She had to believe this because the alternative was that her husband was a monster and her family was a lie. She became the family's emotional caretaker, a role she had been trained for since childhood. She monitored the emotional temperature of their small apartment, constantly trying to keep it from boiling over. She mediated the silent tension between Jack and the world. She tried to create a bubble of normalcy and love for Danny to protect him from the anxieties that hung in the air like thick smoke. She focused on the small things: a well-cooked meal, a clean home, a bedtime story. These were the bricks with which she tried to build a fortress against the unhappiness that threatened to consume them. So for Wendy, the Overlook Hotel was also a symbol of hope, but of a different kind. For her, it was a chance for the family to heal, away from the pressures and judgments of the outside world. She saw the months of isolation as an opportunity for them to reconnect, to become a family unit again. She pictured long, quiet days with Jack finally writing, happy and fulfilled, and Danny playing safely in the snow. She imagined them sitting by a fire in the evenings, reading and talking, the tensions of the past year melting away in the peaceful silence. She was aware of the hotel's solitude, but she was not afraid of it. In her mind, the real danger was out in the world of failed jobs and disapproving glances. The hotel, she thought, would be their sanctuary. She packed their belongings with a sense of optimism, a feeling that this, finally, was the fresh start they all so desperately needed. She was a good woman with a good heart, whose only real flaw was a love so deep that it blinded her to the very clear and present danger that was sleeping in the bed next to her every night. She was willing to follow her husband to the ends of the earth to save her family, never realizing that he was leading them directly into the heart of the abyss. And then there was Daniel Anthony Torrance, a 5-year-old boy with old eyes. Danny was the heart of the Torrance family, and he was also its most sensitive nerve. From a very young age, it was clear that Danny was different. He was a quiet, observant child who seemed to understand things that a boy his age should not. He could sense his parents' moods with an almost supernatural accuracy. He knew when his father was angry long before the shouting started. He could feel his mother's sadness even when she was smiling. This ability, this sensitivity, was something he was born with. His grandmother had called it the shining. It was a kind of psychic sight, an ability to see and feel things that were hidden from most people. For Danny, the shining was not a gift, it was a burden. Imagine being a small child, still learning to make sense of the physical world, and also being bombarded with the invisible world of emotions, thoughts, and memories. It was a constant, overwhelming noise. He would walk into a room and feel the lingering echo of an argument that had happened hours ago. He would look at a stranger and get a flash of their secret sadness. He did not have the emotional tools to process this information. It was all just a confusing and often frightening jumble of feelings. He learned early on to be quiet, to be still, to not draw attention to himself, because attention often came with a fresh wave of intense emotions from the people around him. To help him cope, his mind created a friend, a guide he called Tony. Tony was not like the imaginary friends other children had. He was not a playmate. He was a teacher, a protector. When Danny was very young, Tony was just a vague presence, a feeling of not being alone. As he got older, Tony started to show him things. He would appear in Danny's mind a little older than Danny himself, and he would point things out, showing him glimpses of things that were happening elsewhere, or things that were going to happen. These visions were often fragmented and symbolic, difficult for a small boy to understand. A flash of red, the word red rum appearing and disappearing, a feeling of intense danger associated with a place he had never been. Tony was, in essence, Danny's own shining personified. It was his own subconscious mind trying to process the flood of psychic information and present it in a way he could understand, trying to warn him of the dangers ahead. Danny was trapped in the middle of his parents' silent war. He loved them both with the pure, absolute love of a child. He loved his father even though he was afraid of him. He could feel the good man inside his father, the man who read him stories and called him Doc. But he could also feel the monster, the angry, resentful presence that sometimes took control. He felt his father's immense guilt over the arm-breaking incident as a constant, cold pressure. He knew without being told that his father hated himself for it, and this knowledge made Danny feel guilty too, as if he were somehow to blame for his father's unhappiness. He was fiercely protective of his mother. He could feel her constant anxiety, her desperate efforts to keep the family from falling apart. He saw her forced smiles and her quiet tears when she thought no one was looking. He tried to be a good boy, a perfect boy, in the hopes that his good behavior could somehow fix the broken things in their home. He became the emotional center of their universe, a small planet around which his parents' volatile sons orbited. His well-being was the measure of their success or failure as a family. This was an immense pressure for a child to bear. The prospect of moving to the Overlook Hotel filled Danny with a deep and profound dread. Tony was showing him things, terrible things. He saw flashes of the hotel's long, empty corridors. He saw snow, so much snow, a world of white that was not peaceful but terrifying. And he saw blood. He did not know what it all meant, but the feeling that came with the visions was one of pure, undiluted horror. He tried to tell his parents about his fears, but he did not have the words. How could a 5-year-old explain a psychic premonition? He talked about Tony, but his parents dismissed it as the fantasy of an imaginative child. They were too preoccupied with their own hopes and fears to truly listen to his. Jack saw a writer's retreat. Wendy saw a family sanctuary. But Danny, with his terrible clear sight, saw a trap. He saw a hungry, evil place waiting for them. He was a little boy being led to a slaughterhouse, and he was the only one who could hear the screams of the ghosts that already lived there. So these were the 3 souls who made their way to the mountains as the season began to turn. A father haunted by his past and terrified of his own potential for violence. A mother blinded by love and a desperate need for a happy ending, and a son who could see the future and was paralyzed by the terror of it. They were not a strong, healthy family embarking on a new adventure. They were a fractured, wounded unit, each member holding a piece of a puzzle they could not solve. They were bound together by love, but also by guilt, fear, and secrets. They were the perfect guests for the Overlook Hotel. The hotel had been waiting a long time for a family just like them. It was patient, and it was very, very hungry. It knew that all it had to do was close the doors, let the snow fall, and wait. The Torrance family would do the rest of the work themselves. The foundation was already fractured beyond repair. The only thing left was for the walls to finally come tumbling down. Chapter 2. The Weight of Isolation. The journey from the flat, sprawling suburbs of Boulder to the high, lonely peaks of the Rocky Mountains was like a journey into another world. The family was encased in their old, yellow Volkswagen Beetle, a tiny, fragile capsule of humanity climbing toward the clouds. The air grew thinner, cleaner, and colder with each mile they gained in elevation. Below them, the world they knew, with its traffic and its grocery stores and its noisy neighbors, shrank until it was just a hazy memory on the horizon. Jack was at the wheel, his hands gripping it with a white-knuckled intensity that betrayed his forced cheerfulness. He was performing the role of the good father, the confident leader, taking his family toward a brighter future. He pointed out landmarks, named the distant peaks, and talked with loud, booming enthusiasm about the book he was going to write. It would be a masterpiece, he declared. This solitude was exactly what he needed. The pure mountain air would clear his head. He was talking more to himself than to Wendy or Danny, trying to convince the doubting voice in his own mind that this was not an act of desperation, but a stroke of genius. He was running away from his failures, but he was framing it as a strategic retreat. Wendy sat in the passenger seat, trying her best to mirror his optimism. She agreed with everything he said, adding her own hopeful comments about the beauty of the aspen trees, their leaves a brilliant, shimmering gold in the autumn sun. She was the supportive wife, playing her part in this family drama. But underneath her smile, a quiet unease was beginning to stir. The higher they climbed, the more the silence of the mountains seemed to press in on them. The road became a series of sharp, hairpin turns with nothing but a flimsy guardrail separating them from a dizzying drop. Each turn felt like a step further away from safety, from civilization. She looked at Jack's profile, the hard set of his jaw, and she saw the familiar tension there. He was not as relaxed as he pretended to be. She instinctively reached back and placed a hand on Danny's knee, a small gesture of reassurance for her son, and perhaps for herself as well. Danny sat in the back, small and silent, his face pressed against the cold glass of the window. For him, the journey was not an adventure. It was a slow, creeping dread. The shining was buzzing inside him, a low-frequency hum of anxiety that grew louder with every mile. The beautiful mountains did not look beautiful to him. They looked like jagged teeth, a great stone mouth waiting to swallow their little yellow car. Tony was whispering in his mind, but the messages were fragmented and terrifying. Flashes of a long hallway carpeted in a pattern of ugly, repeating shapes, the sound of a little boy's tricycle echoing in an empty space, and the word that made no sense but filled him with a cold fear every time he saw it scrawled in his mind's eye. Redrum. He did not know what it meant, but he knew it was waiting for them at the top of this mountain. He felt his mother's hand on his knee and was grateful for the warmth, but it could not penetrate the cold terror that was beginning to crystallize around his heart. He was a passenger on a train, and he was the only one who could see that the tracks ended just ahead. Finally, after one last steep climb, they saw it, the Overlook Hotel. It did not appear gradually. It was simply there, commanding the entire peak, a vast and sprawling structure of wood and stone. It was not beautiful. It was immense. It seemed less like a building that had been built by men and more like a natural growth that had erupted from the mountain itself. Its windows were like 100 vacant eyes staring out over the world below with a cold, proprietary gaze. The car sputtered to a halt in the driveway, and the silence that rushed in to fill the space left by the engine's rumble was profound. It was a heavy, ancient silence. For a moment, the three of them just sat there, staring up at the imposing facade. Jack felt a thrill of awe. This was a place of history, of power. He felt that he belonged here. Wendy felt a wave of intimidation. The place was so big, and they were so small. She felt like an intruder. Danny felt a pure, undiluted wave of psychic nausea. The place was screaming. It was a silent, unending scream of pain and rage and memory, and it was directed right at him. Their arrival was met by Mr. Stuart Ullman, the hotel's summer manager. He was a short, precise man, dressed in a perfectly tailored suit that seemed out of place in the rugged mountain setting. He moved with an air of fussy importance, and his smile never quite reached his eyes. He radiated a kind of professional disapproval. He shook Jack's hand with a grip that was firm but brief, and he gave Wendy and Danny a curt nod. It was clear from his demeanor that he had not been in favor of hiring Jack. He had wanted someone with more experience, someone without a family. A family, in Ullman's view, was a complication. an unpredictable element in the carefully managed machine of his hotel. He led them inside, his shoes clicking smartly on the polished floor of the lobby. The inside of the Overlook was even more overwhelming than the outside. The lobby was cavernous, with a ceiling so high it seemed to belong to a cathedral. A huge stone fireplace dominated one wall, big enough for a man to stand inside. The air was cool and smelled of lemon polish, old wood, and something else, something faint and vaguely unpleasant like wilted flowers. Ullman began the tour, his voice echoing in the vast spaces. He showed them the registration desk, the grand staircase, the massive Colorado lounge with its rustic furniture and Native American wall hangings. He pointed out the historical details with a dry, academic pride, but there was no warmth in his words. He was a curator in a museum, not a host in a hotel. Jack was enthralled. He saw the history, the grandeur. He imagined himself sitting in the Colorado lounge by a roaring fire, a glass of something warm in his hand, the words for his great book finally flowing from his mind. He was already fitting himself into the hotel's story, seeing himself as the latest in a long line of distinguished guests. Wendy trailed behind, trying to absorb it all. The scale of the place was disorienting. Every room was designed for crowds of people, for laughter and music and life. To see them all empty and silent was deeply unsettling. The hotel felt hollowed out, like a beautiful corpse. She tried to imagine Danny playing in these grand, empty rooms, and the image that came to her was of a small, lonely figure, lost in the echoing emptiness. The tour continued. Ullman led them through the enormous dining room, where hundreds of tables and chairs stood in silent, orderly rows, waiting for guests who would not arrive for many months. Then he took them into the kitchens, a labyrinth of stainless steel and gleaming copper pots. This was a space that impressed even Wendy. It was a chef's dream, stocked with every imaginable utensil and a pantry large enough to feed a small army. For a moment, she felt a flicker of the hope she had on the drive up. Here, in this well-ordered, practical space, she could create a home. She could cook. She could establish routines. She could build a small, safe world for her family inside this giant, empty one. Then Ullman led Jack into his office, a small, neat room that felt cramped and out of place after the grand spaces of the rest of the hotel. Wendy and Danny were left to wait outside. It was here that Ullman delivered his warning. He sat behind his desk, folded his hands, and fixed Jack with a serious gaze. He explained that the job was not just about enjoying the solitude. The winters were long and brutal. The isolation, he said, could be a problem for some people. He then proceeded to tell Jack the story of the previous winter caretaker, a man named Delbert Grady. Grady had come up with his wife and 2 young daughters, just like Jack. He had seemed like a perfectly normal, reliable man, but the solitude, the sheer, crushing weight of the hotel's emptiness had gotten to him. He had developed a severe case of what Ullman clinically referred to as cabin fever. One day, he had simply broken. He had killed his family with an axe, systematically murdering his 2 little girls and his wife before taking his own life. Ullman told this horrific story in the same flat, unemotional tone he had used to describe the hotel's plumbing system. To him, it was just another piece of the hotel's history, an unfortunate incident that needed to be disclosed to a new employee. Jack listened, a confident smirk playing on his lips. He was not disturbed by the story, he was almost insulted by it. Did Ullman really think he was the same kind of man as this Delbert Grady? Grady was clearly a weak man, a man with no inner resources, no intellectual project to sustain him. Jack had his writing, he had his mind. He was not some simple-minded janitor who would crack under a little bit of loneliness. He saw the story as a challenge to his own strength, and he felt certain he would pass the test. He assured Ullman, with a confidence that bordered on arrogance, that he was not the kind of man to get cabin fever, and that Wendy and Danny were equally resilient. The past was the past, he said. It had nothing to do with him. He dismissed the tragedy of an entire family's destruction as if it were a trivial piece of gossip, a cautionary tale for lesser men. While Jack was being warned, a different kind of conversation was taking place out in the lobby. Danny was wandering near the kitchens when he was approached by an older man, the hotel's head chef, Dick Halloran. Halloran was a tall, kind-faced black man with a warm, genuine smile. He knelt down so he was on Danny's level, and he offered him a piece of chocolate. But the real communication was not happening with words. As soon as Halloran got close to Danny, the boy felt a shock of recognition. The buzzing in his head, the constant anxious noise of The Shining, suddenly became clear and calm. It was like tuning a radio to the one clear station in a sea of static. Halloran was shining, just like him, and his shine was strong, warm, and friendly. Halloran began to speak to him, both out loud and directly in his mind. He asked Danny if he liked ice cream. Danny thought, yes. And Halloran smiled and said, I knew you did. My grandmother and we could have whole conversations without ever opening our mouths. She called it The Shining. For the first time, Danny heard the words spoken by someone other than himself. He was not alone. This strange, frightening thing inside him had a name, and this kind man understood it. The relief was so immense it almost made him cry. Halloran explained that many people had a little bit of the shine, but that Danny's was very powerful. He explained that the hotel itself had a kind of shine too. It was an old place, and a lot of things had happened here, both good and bad. And the Overlook, Halloran explained, had a way of holding on to those things like pictures in a book. He told Danny that he might see some of these pictures, things that had happened long ago. Some of them might be scary, but he had to remember that they were just pictures. They could not hurt him. Then Halloran's mental voice became very serious. He told Danny that there were some places in the hotel that were worse than others, places where the bad memories were stronger. And there was one room in particular that he needed to stay away from. Room 237, he did not explain what was in the room. He just projected a feeling of deep, visceral fear, a warning that was more powerful than any words. Danny, who had already felt a cold pull from that part of the hotel, understood completely. He promised he would stay away. Finally, Halloran gave him a lifeline. He told Danny that if he was ever in real trouble, if he was truly scared and needed help, he should use his shining to call for him. Just think of him, as hard as he could, and Halloran would hear him, no matter how far away he was. It was a promise, a beacon of hope in the terrifying darkness that Danny felt closing in around him. For a few precious minutes, Danny had found a kindred spirit, an adult who understood and believed him. Then his parents returned, the tour was over, and Halloran was gone, leaving with the rest of the summer staff. The brief moment of connection was over, and Danny was alone again with his parents and the hotel's screaming silence. The last of the hotel staff departed in a flurry of activity. Cars and buses rolled down the mountain, leaving behind plumes of exhaust that hung in the cold, thin air. Then there was only the Torrance family's little yellow beetle, looking like a forgotten toy in the vast empty parking lot. Jack, Wendy, and Danny stood on the porch and watched them go. As the last vehicle disappeared around a bend, a profound silence descended upon the Overlook. It was a silence so deep and complete that it felt like a physical presence. The world had been officially shut out. They were alone. That first evening, there was a sense of novelty. of adventure. Wendy made a simple dinner in the massive kitchen, and the three of them ate in the staff dining hall, their voices sounding small and thin in the empty room. Jack was in high spirits, full of plans for his writing schedule. Wendy felt a sense of purpose as she organized their small apartment, their home within the hotel. Even Danny felt a temporary reprieve. The hotel was quiet for now, as if it were watching, waiting. The first snow began to fall a few days later. It started as a gentle flurry, a beautiful, silent descent of white flakes that dusted the pine trees and softened the sharp edges of the landscape. Wendy and Danny watched it from the windows of the Colorado Lounge, enchanted by its beauty. But the snow did not stop. It fell continuously for days, and with each passing hour, the blanket of white grew deeper. The gentle flurry became a thick, heavy curtain, obscuring the view of the mountains, of the sky, of everything. The world outside the hotel was erased, replaced by a swirling, endless void of white. The roads became impassable. The phone lines, as the hotel's winter-beaten equipment finally gave out, went dead. They were officially cut off. The weight of their isolation, which had at first seemed like a romantic notion, now became a stark and undeniable reality. They were on an island in a sea of snow, and there was no way off. It was then that the hotel began its work. It did not start with ghosts or apparitions. It started with subtle whispers, quiet manipulations aimed at the pre-existing weaknesses of its new guests. Its first and most important target was Jack. For the first week or two, he had tried to write. He set up his typewriter on a table in the Grand Colorado Lounge, the empty space his personal study. But the words would not come. The blank page was a mirror reflecting his own emptiness. He felt the old frustration building, the familiar anger at his own inadequacy. He started wandering the hotel, restless and irritable. It was during one of these wanderings, down in the damp, cavernous basement, that he found the scrapbook. It was a large, leather-bound volume left behind by a previous caretaker. It was filled with decades of newspaper clippings, all detailing the dark and sordid history of the Overlook Hotel. Jack took it back to the boiler room, the one place in the hotel that was always warm, and he began to read. He was immediately captivated. The scrapbook was not a history of glamorous parties and famous guests. It was a chronicle of human misery and greed. There were stories of mobster killings, of suicides in the grand suites, of financial scandals that had ruined wealthy men, of adulterous affairs that ended in tragedy. Jack read about the hotel's construction, about the questionable dealings of its original owner, a millionaire rogue named Horace Derwent. He read about unexplained deaths and mysterious disappearances. He was not repulsed by this history. He was fascinated by it. He was a writer in search of a subject, and here it was, a story of epic American corruption and violence delivered right into his hands. He became obsessed. He spent hours and hours in the basement, poring over the yellowed clippings, the boiler hissing and clanking around him like a mechanical beast. He stopped even pretending to work on his play. The hotel had given him a new purpose. It was seducing him, appealing to his ego. It was telling him that he was not a failure. He was a historian, an artist, the chosen one who would tell the hotel's great, terrible story. He began to see the ghosts of the past not as spectres to be feared, but as characters in his grand narrative. He was no longer just the caretaker of the building. He felt he was becoming the keeper of its very soul. While Jack was being seduced by the hotel's past, Danny was being terrorized by its present. The hotel seemed to be testing him, prodding at his shine. The most terrifying of these tests was the topiary. On the hotel grounds, there was a collection of large hedges trimmed into the shapes of animals: a lion, a rabbit, a dog. The first time Danny walked past them, he had the distinct and horrifying sensation that they had moved. He turned around, and they were exactly where they had been before, but he knew. He knew that when his back was turned, the leafy lion had turned its head to watch him. He started taking the long way around to avoid the playground, his heart pounding every time he even glanced in that direction. The visions also became more frequent, more insistent. One afternoon, while riding his big wheel down a long, carpeted hallway, he rounded a corner and saw them. Two little girls standing side by side, holding hands. They were wearing pale blue dresses, and they stared at him with empty, lifeless eyes. They did not speak. They were just there. He blinked, and they were gone. The image was burned into his mind. He began to fear the hotel's empty spaces because he knew that at any moment they might not be empty. Wendy's fear was a slower, more creeping dread. It was not born of supernatural visions, but of very real and growing concerns. The first was the hotel itself. The initial novelty had worn off, and now the vast, empty rooms seemed menacing. The silence was no longer peaceful, it was oppressive. She would be alone in the kitchen, and she would have the unshakable feeling that she was being watched. The sheer scale of the building made her feel small and vulnerable. But her primary source of anxiety was Jack. He was changing. The optimistic, energetic man who had driven them up the mountain was disappearing, replaced by a sullen, irritable stranger. He was not writing. He was spending all his time in the basement, obsessing over that filthy old scrapbook. When she tried to talk to him about it, he would snap at her, his voice sharp and defensive. He accused her of not understanding the artistic process, of trying to hold him back. The familiar tension, the feeling of walking on eggshells, had returned, but it was 100 times worse in this isolated place. There was nowhere to escape. She would see him staring out the windows for hours, a strange, distant look in his eyes. He was pulling away from her and Danny, retreating into a dark world of his own. The hope that this winter would heal their family was dying. In its place was a cold, growing fear that the hotel was not fixing them. It was breaking them piece by piece. The weight of the isolation was pressing down, and the fractures in their family's foundation were beginning to groan under the strain. Chapter 3. The Unraveling. The days in the Overlook Hotel began to lose their shape. Time itself seemed to stretch and warp within the isolated walls, an elastic band pulled taut by the relentless, monotonous silence. The novelty of their situation had long since corroded into a dull, persistent dread. The family, once a unit of 3, had fractured into 3 separate islands of quiet desperation. Wendy moved through the massive, empty rooms like a ghost in training, her days governed by a rigid routine of cleaning and cooking, a desperate attempt to impose a sense of normalcy on a situation that was anything but. Jack remained a creature of the hotel's lower levels, spending his days with the hissing boiler and the scrapbook of horrors, his moods growing darker and more unpredictable with each passing hour. And Danny, the smallest of them, was adrift in a sea of terrifying visions, his only anchor the faint, distant promise of Dick Halloran. The hotel was no longer just a building. It was a living entity, a predator that had successfully separated its prey from the herd and was now beginning to circle, patiently waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The moment would begin, as so many moments of childhood do, with a simple, forbidden object, a key. It was a passkey, a single key that could open any door in the hotel. Jack, in his increasingly erratic state, had taken to carrying it with him, a symbol of his dominion over the vast, empty building. but he was careless. He would leave it on the kitchen counter, or on the nightstand, or on the table in the Colorado lounge where his typewriter sat, unused and collecting a thin film of dust. For Danny, the key was a source of both terror and an almost unbearable curiosity. He knew he should not touch it. Dick Halloran's warning about room 237 echoed constantly in his mind, a clear, sharp note in the cacophony of the hotel's psychic noise. Tony, his inner guide, would scream silent warnings whenever his eyes lingered on the key's brassy shine. "Stay away, do not go there, it is the bad place." But the hotel had its own voice, and it whispered things that were far more seductive. It did not scream, it coaxed. It was a sweet, sickly whisper that seemed to come from the walls themselves. It was a promise of secrets, of answers. What was in that room? Why was it so important? The hotel played on a child's fundamental need to understand, to peel back the curtain and see what lay behind it. The pull of room 237 was not just a thought, it was a physical sensation. Sometimes Danny would be riding his plastic big wheel through the endless patterned corridors, the sound of the wheels a lonely rumble in the silence, and he would feel a gentle but firm pressure guiding him toward the west wing. He would smell something faint on the air, a cloying perfume of old flowers and something else, something like decay. The hotel was baiting a hook, and Danny, despite his fear, was beginning to swim toward it. One afternoon, the temptation became too much to bear. Jack was in the basement, lost in his world of newspaper clippings. Wendy was in the kitchen, the clatter of pots and pans a small, brave sound against the immense silence. The key was on the table, lying next to a stack of blank paper. Danny stood for a long time, just looking at it. His heart was hammering against his ribs. He felt a deep sense of wrongdoing, of trespass. This was a bad idea. He knew it was a bad idea, but the pull was stronger than his fear. His small hand, almost of its own volition, reached out and closed around the cool metal. It felt heavy in his palm, heavy with a significance he could not articulate. He slipped it into his pocket and walked away, his footsteps unnaturally loud on the polished floor. His journey to room 237 was the longest walk of his life. He pushed his big wheel ahead of him, the familiar object a small comfort in the growing dread. The hotel seemed to be watching his every move. The Native American patterns on the wall runners seemed to shift and writhe in his peripheral vision. The portraits of stern-faced men and women from a bygone era seemed to follow him with their painted eyes. The air grew colder as he moved deeper into the west wing, a damp, cellar-like chill that had nothing to do with the winter outside. He finally reached the end of the hall. There was the door. Room 237, the numbers on the plaque seemed to shimmer, to mock him. The door itself was a simple, dark wood, but to Danny it looked like the gate to a tomb. He got off his big wheel and stood before it. The silence here was different. It was not empty. It was a full silence, thick with waiting. He could feel something on the other side of the door, an ancient and patient malice. He took the key from his pocket. His hands were shaking so badly that he had trouble fitting it into the lock. For a moment, he thought about turning back, about running to his mother and confessing. But the hotel's whisper was in his ear now, insistent. Just a look, that is all. Just one little look. He turned the key. The click of the tumblers turning was like a gunshot in the silent hall. The sound seemed to travel down the corridor and die, swallowed by the thick, patterned carpet. He pushed the door, and it swung inward with a low groan. The room was bathed in a strange, purplish light from the heavy curtains that were drawn across the window. Dust motes danced in the single beam of sunlight that managed to pierce the gloom. The room was decorated in shades of purple and green, colours that seemed to have faded and soured over the years. It was a standard hotel suite, with a bed, a small desk, and a couple of armchairs, but it felt deeply, fundamentally wrong. The air was thick and still and smelled of stale perfume and something else, the faint, sweet odour of rot. Danny took a tentative step inside. The door swung shut behind him with a soft but final click, plunging him into a deeper gloom. He was trapped. His attention was drawn to the bathroom. The door was slightly ajar and a thin sliver of white porcelain was visible. The feeling in the room, the sense of a waiting presence, was strongest from that direction. He knew he should not go any closer. He knew he should turn and flee, but he was paralyzed, caught between his own terror and the hotel's powerful will. He took another step, and another, his small sneakers making no sound on the thick carpet. He reached the bathroom door and pushed it open. The bathroom was tiled in a hideous shade of pink. The fixtures were old and tarnished. A dingy shower curtain decorated with faded pink flowers was drawn across the bathtub. The room was empty. For a single, fleeting moment, Danny felt a wave of relief. It was just a room, an ugly, empty room. There was nothing here. He was about to turn away when he heard it. A sound, a soft, wet, sliding sound coming from behind the shower curtain. Then the curtain began to move. It was pushed aside by a hand, a pale, wrinkled hand with long, red fingernails. A woman was in the bathtub. At first, in the dim light, she looked beautiful. She had a perfect porcelain white body and a cascade of dark hair. She rose slowly from the tub, water sluicing from her smooth skin. She smiled at Danny, a slow, seductive smile. She was naked, and she began to walk toward him, her arms outstretched as if to offer an embrace. Danny was frozen in place, not by fear, but by a strange, hypnotic fascination. The hotel was showing him one of its pictures, a picture of beauty and desire. But as the woman stepped out of the tub and into the sliver of light from the main room, the picture began to rot before his eyes. Her skin, which had seemed so smooth and perfect, was now a mottled purplish-grey colour, peeling away from the bone in wet patches. Her eyes, which had seemed alluring, were now milky and dead, clouded over like a fish that had been left in the sun too long. Her smile remained, but it was now the ghastly, fixed grin of a corpse, her lips cracked and her gums a sickly grey colour. A low, gurgling laugh escaped from her throat, a wet, choking sound. She continued to move toward him, her wet feet slapping on the tile floor, leaving damp, grey footprints. The smell of the grave, of damp earth and rotted flesh, filled the small room, and she reached for him with her bloated, waterlogged hands. The hypnotic spell was broken, and pure, animal terror took its place. Danny screamed. It was a thin, reedy sound that was immediately swallowed by the suffocating atmosphere of the room. He turned and ran, scrambling out of the bathroom, out of the bedroom, fumbling blindly for the doorknob. He could feel her cold, dead breath on the back of his neck. He felt her fingers, as cold as ice and as soft as mud, brush against his skin as he finally managed to wrench the door open and stumble out into the hallway. He fell to the floor, gasping for air. The horrifying image of the rotting woman burned behind his eyelids. The door to room 237 slammed shut with a deafening bang, and Danny Torrance knew no more. Wendy found him a short time later. She had called his name, and the silence that answered was more frightening than any shout. She began a frantic search, her heart pounding with a familiar, maternal anxiety. She found him curled up in the hallway of the West Wing, his big wheel lying on its side next to him. He was not crying, he was not moving. He was staring into space with wide, vacant eyes, his body trembling with a fine, continuous shudder. He was in a state of shock, completely unresponsive. Wendy scooped him up in her arms. He felt as light as a bundle of sticks, and his skin was cold to the touch. She carried him back to their apartment, her mind racing. What had happened? Had he fallen? Had he seen something that frightened him? She laid him down on his bed and covered him with a blanket, whispering soothing words that he did not seem to hear. She sat with him for a long time, stroking his hair, waiting for him to come back to her. When he finally emerged from his catatonic state, it was not a gentle waking. He began to sob, deep, racking sobs that shook his entire small frame. He clung to her, his face buried in her shoulder, and he would not let go. Wendy held him tight, rocking him back and forth, trying to absorb his terror into her own body. It was then, as she was helping him change into his pajamas, that she saw them. The marks. On his neck, just below his jawline, were a series of dark, ugly bruises. They were purplish and green, and they were unmistakably in the shape of fingers. Small, cruel fingerprints pressed into the delicate skin of her son. For a moment, Wendy's mind went blank. It simply could not process the information. The bruises were a fact, an undeniable piece of physical evidence that did not fit into any logical framework. She stared at them, her blood turning to ice water in her veins. Who could have done this? Her mind, trained to find rational explanations, scrambled for an answer. Had he fallen against something? No, these were not the marks of a fall. Had he done it to himself? Impossible. Then the terrible, unthinkable logic began to assert itself. There were only 3 people in the Overlook Hotel, 3 living people. She had not touched him. Danny had not done this to himself, and that left only one other person. The thought was a physical blow. It knocked the air from her lungs and made the room spin. Jack. The image that flashed into her mind was not of the man she loved, the brilliant, troubled writer. It was the image of Jack on that day in Boulder, his face contorted with a rage she had never seen before or since. She remembered the sound of Danny's arm breaking. She remembered the shame and the horror in Jack's eyes afterward, and his endless, desperate promises that it would never, ever happen again. She had believed him. She had built her entire world on the foundation of that belief. And now, as she looked at the new bruises on her son's neck, that foundation crumbled into dust. The monster was not gone. It had not been vanquished by sobriety or isolation. It had only been sleeping. And now, in this lonely, haunted place, it had woken up. All the small, creeping fears of the past few weeks, Jack's moodiness, his obsession with the scrapbook, his growing distance, all of it suddenly clicked into place. They were not just signs of stress, they were warning signs that she had deliberately, willfully ignored because she was too afraid to face the truth. The hope that had sustained her, the belief that they could heal their family here, was revealed for what it was: a childish fantasy. There was no healing this. There was only a sick, repeating pattern of violence. Her love for Jack warred with a new, ferocious emotion, a mother's protective rage. That rage won. Jack entered the room a few minutes later. He was in a foul mood, having spent another fruitless hour in the basement, the hotel's history offering him stories, but no words of his own. He came in to complain, to vent his frustration, to find some fault with the world that was not his own. He saw Wendy sitting on the bed, holding Danny, and he saw the look on her face. It was a look he had not seen since the day he broke his son's arm. It was a look of cold, unforgiving fury. "What is it now?" he snapped, his voice already laced with the defensive anger that had become his default setting. Wendy did not answer immediately. She gently turned Danny so that the bruises on his neck were visible. She looked up at Jack, and her eyes were not the soft, forgiving eyes he knew. They were as hard and as cold as chips of ice. "You did this," she said. Her voice was not loud. It was a low, trembling whisper, but it carried the weight of a final judgment. "You went into his room while he was sleeping and you hurt him." Jack stared at her, then at the bruises. His first reaction was a genuine baffled confusion. He had no idea what she was talking about. He had not touched Danny. He had been in the basement for hours. "What are you talking about?" he asked. "I didn't do anything." "Don't lie to me, Jack." Wendy's voice grew stronger, fueled by her certainty. "Don't you dare lie to me. There's no one else here. Who else could it have been? Did he do it to himself? Is that what you're going to say?" The accusation, so absolute and so unjust, hit Jack like a physical force. It was the ultimate betrayal. He had spent every single day since the arm-breaking incident trying to atone. He had given up drinking, the one crutch that had ever offered him relief. He had swallowed his pride and taken this menial job. He had fought against the anger and resentment inside him, a constant, exhausting battle. He had done all of this for them, for his family. And at the first sign of trouble, this was her conclusion. That he was the monster, that he was guilty without a trial, without a shred of evidence beyond her own fearful imagination. She did not even ask him what happened. She had already convicted him. His confusion curdled into a deep, volcanic rage. The injustice of it was a searing pain. It was not just Wendy accusing him. It was the world. It was his father, his old students, Mr. Ullman, everyone who had ever looked at him and seen a failure, a man with a bad temper. Her words confirmed his deepest, darkest fear about himself, and he hated her for it. "You're crazy," he spat, his voice shaking with a fury that was all the more potent for being righteous. "I never touched him. You know I would never touch him again." "I don't know anything anymore," Wendy said, pulling Danny closer to her, a gesture of protection that drove a dagger into Jack's heart. She was protecting their son from him. "Except that my son is hurt, and his father is the only one who could have done it." That was the moment everything broke. For Jack, this accusation was the final, unforgivable sin. If Wendy, the one person who was supposed to believe in him, was now his accuser, then he had nothing left to fight for. The bond of trust that had held their fragile family together snapped. In that moment, Jack Torrance turned away from his wife and son, and he turned completely toward the only other entity that seemed to understand him, that seemed to believe in his importance. The Overlook Hotel. His family thought he was a monster. Fine, the hotel was full of monsters. Maybe that was where he belonged. He stormed out of the apartment, slamming the door so hard that a picture fell off the wall. He was not just angry, he was wounded to the core of his soul. He needed to be vindicated. He needed to prove her wrong. There had to be a logical explanation for Danny's bruises. He remembered Danny's story, the one he had dismissed as a childish nightmare about a crazy woman in one of the rooms. The boy had been terrified of something, and he had been found in the West Wing. The answer, Jack thought with a surge of angry purpose, must be in room 237. His walk to the room was a march of righteous indignation. He was not a frightened child, drawn by a supernatural whisper. He was an angry man on a mission to uncover the truth and throw it back in his wife's face. He used the passkey and threw the door to room 237 open, striding in as if he owned the place. The room was just as Danny had found it, dusty and silent, steeped in its sour, purplish gloom. He scanned it with a quick, dismissive glance. Nothing. Just an old, unused hotel room. He felt a surge of triumph. There was nothing here. Danny had had a nightmare and had somehow hurt himself in his terror. He would go back and tell Wendy, and she would have to apologize. He moved toward the bathroom, his confidence growing with every step. He would check every inch of this place just to be thorough. He pushed open the bathroom door, the pink tile, the tarnished fixtures, the faded shower curtain. He strode over to the tub and ripped the curtain back with a dramatic flourish. The tub was empty. It was stained and grimy, but it was empty. He laughed, a short, barking sound that held no humor. "See?" he said aloud to his absent, accusatory wife. "Nothing. Absolutely nothing." He was turning to leave, a smug, vindicated smile on his face, when he heard the sound. A soft rustle from behind him. He spun around. The shower curtain, which he had just thrown aside, was now drawn closed again. He stared at it, his heart giving a sudden, hard lurch. He must have been mistaken. He must have only pulled it halfway. He reached out to pull it back again, and it was then that he saw her. The woman. She rose up from the tub, the curtain parting before her as if by magic. And just as she had for Danny, she appeared to Jack as a vision of ethereal beauty. She was young, elegant, with a perfect body and a knowing, seductive smile. She was the ghost of the hotel's glamorous, decadent past. She was everything his wife was not. Wendy was tired, anxious, a constant reminder of his responsibilities and failures. This woman was pure, uncomplicated desire. She looked at him with an expression of pure adoration, as if she had been waiting just for him. She stepped out of the tub and began to walk toward him, her movements fluid and graceful. Jack was not afraid. He was mesmerized. The hotel was offering him a gift, a reward. It was showing him that he was still a man who could be desired. It was a powerful, intoxicating balm for his wounded ego. The woman reached him and put her arms around his neck, pulling him into an embrace. Her skin was cool but smooth. He could smell her perfume. For a moment he closed his eyes and gave himself over to the fantasy. And then he opened them. He was not holding a beautiful woman. He was holding a corpse. The skin he was touching was now bloated and grey, the skin of a body that had been submerged in water for a very long time. The arms around his neck were heavy and wet, and when he looked at her face, he saw the same horrifying vision his son had seen. The clouded, dead eyes. The skin sloughing off the bone. The lipless grin of a long-dead thing. And the smell. The smell was no longer perfume. It was the thick, stomach-turning stench of putrefaction. A choked gasp of horror escaped his lips. He shoved her away, and she stumbled backward, collapsing into the tub with a wet, heavy thud. Jack scrambled backward, falling out of the bathroom and into the bedroom. He crab-walked away from the door, his mind reeling, unable to process the shift from seductive dream to waking nightmare. He got to his feet and fled the room, slamming the door behind him, his heart pounding with a terror that was made all the worse for the seduction that had come before it. He stumbled back to the apartment, his face pale, his mind a whirlwind of confusion and fear. He had seen it. He had seen what hurt Danny. He had proof that he was innocent. But as he stood outside the door to their apartment, a new, colder thought took hold. If he told Wendy the truth, what would happen? She would be terrified. She would want to leave. She would try to find a way to get the snowcat started, to call for help on the radio. She would try to take him away from the Overlook, away from his book, away from the one place that seemed to understand his greatness. The hotel had tested him, and now it was offering him a choice. He could side with his hysterical, untrusting wife, or he could side with the powerful, secret life of the hotel. He made his choice. He opened the door and walked in. Wendy looked up at him, her face a mixture of fear and hope. "Well?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Did you see anything?" Jack looked at her, his face a carefully constructed mask of calm reason. "No," he said, his voice steady and firm. "There's nothing in that room, not a thing. It was just an empty room." Wendy stared at him, her last hope dying. "But Danny's neck," she began. Jack cut her off. "He did it to himself," he said, the words tasting like poison and power in his mouth. "Or maybe his imaginary friend Tony did it. But there is nothing in room 237. You've been working yourself up over nothing." It was a monstrous lie, a profound and final betrayal of his son and his wife. With that lie, Jack Torrance sealed his pact with the Overlook Hotel. He had chosen the ghosts over his own family. From that moment on, his descent was swift and irreversible. He no longer tried to fight the hotel's influence. He welcomed it. He stopped sleeping, wandering the halls at all hours of the night, talking to himself, or perhaps to the hotel's unseen residents. His temper, once a flickering flame, was now a constant, burning inferno. He disconnected the radio, the one possible link to the outside world, claiming it was broken beyond repair. He was ensuring that his family, his audience, could not escape the final act of his tragedy. His mind finally broke one night in the gold room. He was wandering, tormented by his thirst, by his rage, by his loneliness. He pushed open the doors to the grand ballroom, and in his desperation, he walked to the long, empty bar. He leaned his forehead against the cool wood and closed his eyes. "I'd give my goddamn soul for a drink," he whispered into the darkness. And the hotel, which had been listening all along, obliged him. A soft light began to glow behind the bar. When Jack looked up, the room was no longer dark and empty. It was filled with the ghosts of a grand party, men in tuxedos and women in shimmering gowns. Music, a ghostly tune from the 1920s, drifted on the air. And behind the bar, wiping a glass with a clean white cloth, was a bartender. He was a man with slicked back hair and a professional, impassive smile. "The name is Lloyd," the bartender said, his voice smooth and reassuring. "And what will it be, Mr. Torrance?" Jack stared, his mind no longer capable of distinguishing reality from hallucination. He asked for a bourbon. Lloyd poured it, the phantom liquid glinting in the phantom lights. Jack picked up the glass. He had been sober for months, but his sobriety had brought him nothing but misery and false accusations. The hotel, the ghosts, they understood him. They were offering him solace. He drank. The liquor burned a clean, wonderful path down his throat, and for the first time in a long time, the angry, anxious noise in his head went quiet. He had another, and another. He was home. While Jack was communing with the spirits of the damned, Wendy's fear had finally solidified into a desperate resolve. She could no longer live in denial. Jack was not just stressed or moody, he was sick, he was dangerous. She and Danny had to get away from him, away from this terrible place. She waited until Jack had stumbled out of the gold room and passed out in one of the hallways. Then, with a shaking hand, she went to the Colorado lounge. She had to know what he had been doing, what secrets his typewriter held. A part of her, a small, foolish, hopeful part, still thought she might find the pages of a brilliant play, a sign that the man she loved was still in there somewhere. She approached the writing desk. A neat stack of manuscript paper, hundreds of pages thick, sat next to the typewriter. She picked up the top page. It was filled with typing, a solid block of text. Her heart leapt. He had been working. She looked closer to read the words. And then the world fell away. The page was covered with a single sentence, typed over and over again, line after line. All work and no play makes Jack a dull boy. Her breath caught in her throat. It had to be a mistake, a joke. She flipped to the next page. It was the same. And the next, the same. She began to flip through the stack, faster and faster, a rising tide of panic choking her. Hundreds of pages, the words were arranged in different patterns, sometimes in the shape of a glass, sometimes in long, poetic stanzas, but they were always the same words, the same insane, meaningless mantra. All work and no play makes Jack a dull boy. All work and no play makes Jack a dull boy. All work and no play makes Jack a dull boy. This was not a manuscript. This was a testament to a mind that had completely and utterly shattered. This was the work of a madman. The last flickering ember of her hope was extinguished, plunged into an icy darkness. The man she had married was gone. In his place was a monster, a creature animated by the evil of this hotel. And she was trapped here with him, miles from anywhere, with a blizzard raging outside and a small, terrified boy to protect. She heard a noise behind her, a slow, shuffling footstep. She turned, the mad pages clutched in her hand. Jack was standing in the doorway, a strange, knowing smile on his face. He had found her. The unraveling was complete. There was nothing left now but the screaming. Chapter 4. The Last Lullaby. The rustle of the paper in Wendy's hands was the only sound in the vast, silent Colorado lounge. It was a small, dry sound, like dead leaves skittering across pavement, but in that moment it was louder than a scream. The pages, filled with the mad repeating sentence, felt slick and unclean, a physical manifestation of her husband's shattered mind. She stood frozen, a statue of dawning horror, her back to the doorway. The shuffle of a footstep behind her was the sound of the trap springing shut. She did not need to turn to know who was there. The very air in the room had changed, growing thick and cold, charged with a predatory energy that was chillingly familiar yet horribly new. This was not the familiar, resentful tension of her husband's bad moods. This was something else. This was the presence of a hunter that has finally cornered its prey. Slowly, she turned. Jack stood in the archway, his body silhouetted against the dim light of the corridor. He was not the man she had married. His shoulders were hunched, his posture that of a beast, trying to make itself seem larger, more threatening. But it was his face that stopped her breath. He was smiling. It was a wide, terrible smile that stretched his lips but did not touch his eyes. His eyes were flat and dead, like the eyes of a shark, empty of all reason and recognition. They were the eyes of a stranger wearing her husband's face. He looked at the manuscript pages in her hand, and his smile widened into a ghastly, knowing leer. "I'm glad you like it," he said. His voice was different too. It had a strange, lilting quality, a playful, sing-song tone that was more terrifying than any shout. "I've been working very hard on it. I think it's my masterpiece. What do you think, Wendy? Do you think the critics will approve?" He took a step into the room, and then another. Each step was slow, deliberate, the movement of an animal savoring the final moments of the chase. Wendy's mind, which had been paralyzed with shock, suddenly kicked into a state of high, frantic alert. The instinct for survival, raw and primal, surged through her. This was not a marital dispute. This was not an argument she could soothe with soft words and careful apologies. The man in front of her was not her husband. He was a monster, and he was going to kill her. He was going to kill her, and he was going to kill Danny. The thought of Danny, her sweet, vulnerable son, was a jolt of pure, cold adrenaline. It burned away the fear and left behind a core of fierce, maternal resolve. She was not going to die here, and she was not going to let her son die. "Jack," she said, her voice a reedy, trembling thing. She held up the manuscript pages as if they were a shield. "Jack, what is this? What's happened to you?" She was backing away from him, one slow step at a time, her eyes darting around the room, searching for an escape, for a weapon, for anything. "Happened to me?" Jack chuckled, a low, guttural sound. "Nothing's happened to me. I've finally woken up. I see things clearly now. I see what needs to be done. I have a responsibility, Wendy, a responsibility to the hotel, to the management. They have certain expectations of me." He continued his slow, inexorable advance. The huge, empty lounge which had once felt so intimidating now felt like a cage, a vast, open-air cage with nowhere to hide. Her back hit a small table. A bottle of bourbon, one that Jack must have taken from the gold room, sat on it. A weapon. Without thinking, she grabbed it. The weight of it in her hand was a small, solid comfort. She held it in front of her, her knuckles white. "Stay back, Jack," she warned, her voice gaining a sliver of strength. "I'm warning you. Don't come any closer." Jack stopped. He looked at the bottle in her hand and then back at her face. He threw his head back and laughed, a loud, booming, insane sound that echoed off the high ceilings. "Are you going to hit me with that, Wendy Bear?" he taunted, using a pet name that was now a venomous mockery. "After all my hard work to stay off the stuff, that's not very supportive of you. Not supportive at all." He took another step, closing the distance between them. He was a few feet away now. She could smell the stale, phantom liquor on his breath. She could see the empty, murderous light in his eyes. He lunged. It was not a clumsy, drunken stumble. It was a sudden, explosive movement, fast and deadly. Wendy did not have time to think. She just reacted. As he came at her, she swung the bottle with all the strength she possessed. It was a wild, desperate arc, fueled by pure terror. There was a sickening, hollow crack as the heavy glass connected with the side of his head. Jack's eyes widened in momentary surprise, and then they rolled back in their sockets. He staggered, a low groan escaping his lips, and then he collapsed to the floor like a sack of stones, a dark stain of blood beginning to spread in his hair. For a moment, Wendy just stood there, gasping for air, the shattered neck of the bottle still clutched in her hand. The silence of the hotel rushed back in, more profound and terrifying than ever. She had done it. She had fought back. She had knocked him out. But she knew with a certainty that was as cold and hard as the floor beneath her feet that this was not over. It was just a temporary reprieve. He would wake up. And when he did, he would be even more dangerous. She had to do something. She had to restrain him. She had to get Danny and get out. The pantry, the walk-in pantry in the kitchen. It was a small, windowless room with a thick, solid door and a heavy bolt on the outside. It was the only place in the entire hotel that could possibly serve as a cell. The thought of what she had to do was nauseating, but the image of Danny's small, trusting face gave her a strength she did not know she possessed. She dropped the broken bottle and grabbed Jack under his arms. He was a dead weight, heavy and limp. She began to drag him. It was a slow, agonizing process. She pulled him out of the Colorado lounge, his head lolling, leaving a thin, dark smear on the ornate carpet. She dragged him across the lobby, past the grand staircase, her breath coming in ragged, painful sobs. She hauled him through the swinging doors of the dining room, the empty tables and chairs like silent, judging spectators. Finally, she reached the kitchens, the familiar, practical space, now the scene of a waking nightmare. She pulled him across the black and white tiled floor to the pantry. With a final, desperate surge of strength, she managed to roll his unconscious body inside. He lay on the cold concrete floor, amid sacks of flour and sugar, a fallen giant. She slammed the heavy door shut, and with a shaking hand, slid the thick metal bolt into place. The sound of it locking was a loud, definitive chunk. He was trapped. She leaned her forehead against the cool wood of the door, her entire body trembling with exhaustion and relief. They were safe. For now. She ran back to their apartment, her mind a chaotic whirl of plans. She had to get to the snowcat. It was their only chance. She burst into the room and found Danny sitting on his bed, his eyes wide with a fear that showed he had heard, or perhaps felt, everything. "Danny," she said, trying to keep her voice calm, a task that was almost impossible. "We have to go. We're leaving now. Put on your coat." Danny, with the silent, solemn understanding of a child who has lived his life in a war zone, did as he was told without a word. Wendy rushed to the radio in the manager's office, her heart sinking when she saw that Jack had been telling the truth in his own twisted way. The tubes were smashed, the wires torn out. He had destroyed it. Her last hope was the snowcat. She bundled Danny up, and they made their way to the shed where the machine was kept. The cold of the winter night was a shocking, painful slap after the artificial warmth of the hotel. The snow was still falling, a thick, blinding curtain of white. She fumbled with the keys to the shed, her fingers numb and clumsy. She finally got the door open, and her blood ran cold. The snowcat's engine was exposed, its vital parts ripped out and scattered on the greasy floor. The battery was gone. He had thought of everything. He had systematically, methodically cut off every possible avenue of escape. They were trapped, truly trapped. Defeated, she led Danny back inside the oppressive warmth of the hotel. There was nowhere to go. They were prisoners, waiting for the jailer to wake up. They retreated to their apartment, the only space that still felt remotely like their own. Wendy locked the door and sat with Danny on the bed, holding him close, listening. For a long time, there was nothing but the sound of the wind howling outside and the frantic beating of her own heart. Then a new sound began, a low, rhythmic banging. It was coming from the direction of the kitchen. Jack was awake. The banging grew louder, more insistent. It was the sound of a fist, then a shoulder, being thrown against the thick pantry door. Then came his voice. At first, it was pleading. "Wendy!" he called, his voice muffled by the door. "Wendy, baby, let me out. I'm sorry, I don't know what happened. I just blacked out. Please, honey, let me out of here. It's cold." Wendy squeezed her eyes shut, a tear tracing a path through the grime on her cheek. It was his voice, his normal voice. For a heart-stopping moment, she almost believed him. Maybe it was over. Maybe the fit had passed. But then the voice changed. A new voice, a colder, more formal voice, seemed to be speaking with him. Wendy could not hear the other side of the conversation, but Jack's responses grew more and more unhinged. "Yes," he said. "Yes, I understand. They can be very willful. A woman's willfulness is a dangerous thing. It must be corrected." There was a pause. "Yes, sir, I see that now. My son, too. He has a great deal of will, a defiant will. He has been a very, very bad boy." Then his voice turned back to the door, and all traces of the man she knew were gone. It was a cold, hateful snarl. "You bitch," he hissed. "You locked me in here. You think you can stop me. You think you can stand in the way of my responsibilities. The management has been very disappointed in my progress. They expect me to deal with you, to correct you, and I will. Oh yes, I will. You just wait. You just wait until I get out of here." The banging stopped. An even more terrifying silence fell. Wendy held her breath, listening. What was happening? And then she heard it, a faint metallic scraping sound, then a loud, triumphant clang as the bolt on the outside of the pantry door was slid back. Someone had let him out. Or something. The hotel had let him out. The truth of her situation settled upon her with the weight of a tombstone. She was not fighting her husband anymore. She was fighting the hotel itself, and the hotel had just armed its chosen soldier. She grabbed Danny and ran, not to the main door of the apartment, but to the bathroom. It was a small, cramped room, but the door was solid. It was their only chance for a fortress. She slammed it shut and turned the lock just as she heard the outer door of the apartment splinter and crash open. Heavy, deliberate footsteps crossed the living room. They stopped outside the bathroom door. Wendy, Jack's voice was a low, crooning whisper now, a predator soothing its cornered meal. Little pigs, let me come in. Not by the hair on your chinny chin. Then I'll huff, and I'll puff, and I'll blow your house in. Then came a sound that would haunt her nightmares for the rest of her life. A heavy, rhythmic, splintering crash against the door. Thump, thump, thump. She looked around the small bathroom in a panic. The window. It was small, high up on the wall, but it was a chance. It was the only chance. She lifted Danny, his small body trembling violently. "Danny, listen to me," she whispered, her voice urgent. "You have to climb out this window. You have to run and hide. Do you understand? Go to the snow shed. Hide there. Don't make a sound." He was crying, but he nodded, his eyes wide with a terror that mirrored her own. She helped him scramble onto the toilet, then onto the small countertop. He was just able to reach the latch. He struggled with it for a moment, then it gave way. He pushed the window open. A blast of icy wind and snow filled the small room. Thump, crack, a long split appeared in the wood of the door. "Danny, go now!" Wendy urged, her voice breaking. He squeezed through the small opening and dropped into the soft snowdrift outside. For a moment, his small, frightened face looked back at her. Then he was gone, a small shadow swallowed by the swirling white. Now it was her turn. She tried to follow him, but the window was too small. Her shoulders were too broad. She could not fit. She was trapped. Thump, crack, boom. A large section of the door splintered inward, and a face appeared in the opening. It was Jack, his face a mask of insane glee, his eyes glittering. But he was not carrying an axe. In his hands, he held something from the hotel's past, something that had been used for a gentleman's game on the hotel's once manicured lawns. It was a roquet mallet, a heavy, long-handled wooden hammer. He grinned at her through the hole in the door. "Here's Johnny!" he roared, a line from a television show that was rendered utterly insane by the context. He began to hammer at the doorknob, the mallet striking with brutal, methodical force. Outside, Danny was running. The snow was up to his waist, each step a monumental effort. The wind was a physical force, trying to push him back toward the hotel, back toward the monster that had once been his father. He was crying, his tears freezing on his cheeks. But through the fear, a small, clear thought began to form, a thought planted there long ago by a kind man in the hotel kitchen. Dick Halloran. "Call me if you need me. Call me." Danny squeezed his eyes shut and focused all his energy, all his terror, all his shining into a single, desperate, mental scream. He pictured Mr. Halloran's kind face, and he screamed his name into the psychic void. "Halloran, help! Daddy, help us!" Miles away, in a warm condominium in Florida, Dick Halloran sat bolt upright in his bed, his heart pounding. He was drenched in sweat. He had been dreaming of snow, of a little boy running, of a beautiful hotel filled with blood. He felt a psychic jolt so powerful it was like a physical blow. It was the boy, Danny. He was in terrible, terrible trouble. Halloran did not hesitate. He threw on his clothes, grabbed his wallet and keys, and ran out the door, his mind already calculating flight times and charter planes. He had made a promise, and he would not break it. Back at the Overlook, Wendy managed to make her own escape. As Jack finally smashed the lock and burst into the bathroom, she had a small, sharp knife from the pocket of her robe, one she had grabbed without thinking. As he reached for her, she slashed out, cutting his hand deeply. He recoiled with a howl of pain and surprise, giving her just enough time to slip past him and run out of the apartment. The hunt was now on, a deadly game of hide-and-seek in the vast, labyrinthine hotel. Wendy ran, her bare feet slipping on the polished floors, the sound of Jack's footsteps and the rhythmic thump of the mallet against the walls echoing behind her. He was toying with her, calling out to her, telling her to take her medicine. She found a temporary hiding place in one of the guest rooms, her body racked with terror. But the hotel itself seemed to be against her. She heard whispers from the empty beds, saw shadows move in the corners of her eyes. The entire building was a part of him now, an extension of his madness. She knew she could not stay hidden for long. She had to find Danny. She had to get them both out of this nightmare. As she crept through the silent, menacing halls, the hotel presented her with new horrors. She saw a party in the ballroom, the ghostly guests raising their glasses to her as she passed. She saw a man in a dog costume performing for a spectral host. The hotel was showing her its pictures, trying to drive her mad, just as it had done with Jack. But Wendy's sanity was anchored by one powerful thought: Danny. Her love for her son was a shield that the hotel's illusions could not fully penetrate. Meanwhile, Dick Halloran was making his way up the mountain. He had caught a flight to Denver, chartered a small plane to a closer town, and was now in a rented snowcat, battling his way up the treacherous, snow-covered road to the Overlook. The storm was a living thing, a blizzard of epic proportions, as if the hotel itself were using the weather to try and keep him away. The journey was slow, and with every passing minute, the psychic screams of the hotel grew louder in his mind, a chorus of malevolent spirits trying to break his will. But Halloran pushed on, his jaw set, his focus entirely on the little boy who was counting on him. He finally reached the hotel grounds. The place was dark, save for a few lights glowing in the windows. It looked like a great sleeping beast. As he got out of the snowcat, he was immediately attacked. The topiary animals, the great hedge sculptures, were moving. The lion, its leafy form unnaturally animated, lunged at him, scraping at him with sharp, woody claws. Halloran fought back, but he was knocked to the ground, his leg badly injured. The hotel was alive, and it did not welcome visitors. Inside, the final act of the tragedy was beginning. Jack had cornered Wendy on the grand staircase, but her desperate flight had led him away from where Danny was hiding. Danny, seeing his chance, had run back inside the hotel, his small mind working with a desperate clarity. He remembered something from the tour, something his father had been taught, something his father had been forgetting to do in his madness. The boiler. The old, unstable boiler in the basement had to be dumped regularly, its pressure released. His father had not been doing it. He had been too busy with the scrapbook, too busy going mad. The boiler was a bomb, a time bomb sitting in the heart of the hotel. Jack saw Danny. His pursuit of Wendy was forgotten. Here was the real prize, the defiant boy, the boy who was the source of all his trouble. "Danny," he roared, his voice no longer human. "Come here and take your medicine. I've got a licking for you." He began to chase Danny through the hotel, the mallet held high. Danny ran, his small legs pumping, his mind racing. He was not just running away now, he was leading his father on a chase, leading him further and further away from the exits, deeper into the hotel. They reached the top floor. It was a dead end. Danny was trapped. Jack advanced on him, the roquet mallet raised, that terrible, smiling mask on his face. This was the end. But Danny did not cower. He stood his ground. He looked at the monster that was wearing his father's face, and he reached out with his mind, with all the power of his shining. He did not send a scream of terror. He sent a memory. He sent the image of a sunny day in Boulder, of his father teaching him to tie his shoes, of his father calling him Doc and reading him a bedtime story. He pushed past the hotel's rage, past the madness, and he reached for the small, flickering candle of the man who was still trapped inside. "Father, Daddy, the boiler! You forgot the boiler!" The monster in front of him faltered. The mallet lowered a few inches. A flicker of confusion, of pained recognition crossed Jack's face. The dead, flat eyes suddenly cleared, and for a single, beautiful, terrible moment, it was him. It was Jack Torrance. He looked at his son, at the mallet in his own hands, and the full, crushing weight of what he had become fell upon him. His face crumpled, the smile vanishing, replaced by an expression of pure, soul-shattering anguish. "Danny!" he croaked, his real voice raw with pain. "I love you!" Then the monster began to reassert itself, the hotel fighting to regain control. Jack's face contorted in a terrible battle. He fought it. With the last ounce of his own will, he managed to gasp out 2 more words. "Run! Run away!" It was the last act of a loving father. He was telling his son to save himself. Then the hotel took him again, but the message had been delivered to Danny and to himself. The boiler. Jack's body, now just a puppet for the hotel's will, turned and began to stumble, to run, not after Danny, but toward the basement. It had to save its vessel. It had to save itself. Danny did not wait. He ran. He ran down the stairs, past a wounded but conscious Dick Halloran, who was crawling his way inside. He ran past his mother, who was emerging from her hiding place. He ran out the front doors into the cold, clean, purifying snow. Wendy and Halloran followed him. They huddled together, a broken, bleeding trio, and they looked back at the Overlook Hotel. Down in the basement, Jack reached the boiler room. The pressure gauge was in the red, the needle vibrating, pushed past its limit. The great iron furnace was glowing, groaning under the immense, unstable pressure. He was too late. There was a great, hissing roar, and then the world turned white. The heart of the Overlook Hotel exploded. A fireball erupted from the center of the building, blowing out the windows, consuming the grand rooms, the haunted corridors, the ghosts, the memories, the scrapbook, and the body of its last, most tragic caretaker. The Overlook, a monument to a century of human misery, screamed its last and was consumed by fire. Out in the snow, the 3 survivors watched the great beast burn. Halloran wrapped his coat around Danny, shielding him from the sight. Wendy wept, not with joy, but with a profound, bottomless grief. They were alive, they had survived, but it was not a victory. There is no victory in a tragedy. The hotel was gone, but it had taken her husband with it. It had taken Danny's father. They were saved, but they were not whole. They would carry the ghosts of that winter with them for the rest of their lives. The tragedy of the Torrance family was not that they had died in a haunted hotel, but that a part of them had, and the parts that were left would be forever scarred by the silence, the snow, and the last terrible lullaby of the Overlook Hotel.